There's a silent paradox that lies at the heart of all genuine human existence. A paradox that most people feel intuitively, but avoid consciously facing, because it challenges the way they would like life to work. If you take a moment and look closely at the people around you who you truly respect, those whose presence touches something deep within your being, those whose wisdom you would genuinely like to possess, those whose maturity and understanding you admire without reservation, you will notice something that perhaps makes you uncomfortable to recognize. These people didn't live particularly easy lives. They were not spared from difficulties, confrontations, losses, and profound disappointments. In fact, often the opposite is true. Those people you most admire have often endured hardships that you would expect would have destroyed them. Many of them have experienced tragedies that make their lives seem trivial in comparison. Many of them have known despair, known humiliating failure, known the death of everything they loved or believed in. And yet, not only did they survive these experiences, they emerged from them transformed into something much nobler, much wiser, much more capable of genuine compassion and understanding than they probably would have been had they been spared this hardship. Rudolf Steiner, one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, dedicated much of his life to the intense study and articulation of this truth that most of humanity instinctively recognizes but consciously resists fully accepting. Steiner offered a fundamentally different view from that of the dominant culture about what the true nature of suffering is and what its true role in human life is. For him, suffering was not an unfortunate accident of the universe. It was not an indication that something had gone terribly and fundamentally wrong in the divine design of creation. It was not a cosmic injustice that should be eliminated completely if we had the ability to do so. It was not even a punishment for sin or wrongdoing, although it was often accompanied by guilt and shame that made it appear that way. It was rather an extraordinarily sophisticated tool of education, an instrument through which the human soul is forged and transformed into something it could not otherwise become. He was a teacher who, although he was viscerally rejected by the learning soul, was absolutely indispensable for genuine learning to occur. It was a paradoxical expression of cosmic love for human development. This vision offered no easy comfort or cheap escapism, but it offered something much more valuable. It offered genuine meaning to suffering and a possible path to transforming it into real spiritual growth that would last through multiple lifetimes and multiple planes of existence. To truly and deeply understand what Steiner was really saying about suffering and development, you first need to completely free yourself from the culturally ingrained notion that life should be first and foremost pleasant, that existence is fundamentally about collecting pleasurable experiences and avoiding unpleasant experiences. This is an idea that contemporary culture insistently promotes in practically all its narratives, advertising, entertainment, and popular psychology. We are told constantly and in multiple ways that you should seek happiness as the highest good, that life is truly about accumulating pleasant experiences that you can cherish and remember, that the ultimate goal of every activity, every endeavor, every effort should be personal comfort and the satisfaction of private desires. Established philosophers, publicists, digital influencers, and even psychologists continually tell you that you deserve to be happy, that your deepest desires are valid and should be pursued without guilt, that your personal preferences for what is pleasant and for avoiding what is unpleasant should be the primary and practically indisputable guide for your life choices. But Rudolf Steiner offered a perspective that was profoundly and radically different from this dominant cultural narrative. Steiner asked a question that most people had never seriously considered. What really and truly is the fundamental purpose of human existence? Do you really honestly believe in your heart that it is merely collecting pleasant and pleasurable moments and successfully avoiding unpleasant and painful moments? Does this vision really capture the depth of what you feel when you're confronting the most important questions about your life? Or is there something much deeper hidden beneath this superficial narrative? Something that would truly justify devoting your entire life to it? Something that would offer genuine meaning and purpose to your entire existence? Steiner's answer was unequivocal and firm. Human life has a much deeper and nobler purpose than merely collecting comfort. That purpose is nothing less than the continuous development of consciousness, the progressive expansion of human inner capabilities, the gradual transformation of your own nature towards something much higher, much more conscious and much more noble than you are at this moment. And this development of consciousness, by its very essential nature, demands profound confrontation, demands continuous death and rebirth, demands suffering that forces transformation. Let us think more deeply and systematically about how any true growth, any genuine development actually works in the material and physical realm that we can all observe and verify. A tree does not become strong, resilient, and capable of surviving storms by growing in a perfectly sheltered park where no turbulent winds ever disturb it, where rain falls only in ideal quantities, where the temperature remains comfortably moderate. It becomes strong and resilient by repeatedly facing stormy winds that test it severely and constantly force it to develop a thicker trunk and deeper, more extensive roots. An athlete does not become proficient and master his sport by avoiding all forms of physical discomfort, avoiding any sensation of fatigue or muscle pain, always remaining in the physical comfort zone. Become proficient and excellent through hard, disciplined training that pushes your body far beyond its initial comfortable limits, which creates repeated discomfort and even pain that forces physiological adaptation. A student does not genuinely master a difficult academic subject by finding a teacher who always makes him comfortable intellectually and who never really challenges him with problems that exceed his understanding. Learning really requires genuine frustration. It requires repetition of mistakes and failure. It requires the deeply unpleasant experience of failing to understand something that you're desperately and anxiously trying to understand. In every case, in every domain of life you look at, growth comes through real resistance, through persistent discomfort, through direct confrontation with previously comfortable limits. Steiner was arguing that the same fundamental truth applies, and in fact applies even more deeply and more crucially, to spiritual growth and the deeper development of human consciousness. Perhaps even more true for the spiritual domain than for any other domain. Because spiritual growth is the deepest kind of growth possible. It is growth that affects not just your practical skills or your intellectual knowledge, not just your ability to do things or understand things, but that affects your own fundamental essence as a conscious being. It changes who you are at the root, not just what you can do. And growth of such depth, growth that actually changes the nature of your consciousness, requires suffering. It demands death. It demands rebirth. Now the inevitable and important question that everyone faces when we consider this proposition arises. If suffering is truly so important and so necessary for growth, and if spiritual growth is truly so profound that it is transformative at the level of consciousness, then how much suffering is really necessary? Is there a point where suffering becomes excessive, becomes counterproductive, becomes merely destructive without any educational qualities? Steiner offered a remarkably subtle and sophisticated understanding of this critical issue. He carefully distinguished between several fundamentally different types of suffering, each with a very different origin, quality, and effect. There is first that suffering which is the direct result of personal ignorance or self-neglect. If you consciously do not eat properly for many months, you inevitably suffer from malnutrition and fatigue. This kind of suffering is not educational in the sense that Steiner was describing. It is not the result of the necessary confrontation with realities that transcend your control. It is simply and exclusively a result of your own negligence and your refusal to take adequate care of yourself. And this type of suffering, according to Steiner, should be stopped and eliminated through the cultivation and appropriate development of healthy habits and self-care. Likewise, there is suffering that is a direct result of structural social injustice, of systematic oppression, of violence perpetrated by some against others. This is also a type of suffering that should be vigorously combated and minimized through dedicated social work and through fundamental structural change in the societies that perpetuate this injustice. Steiner was not an ethereal mystic, indifferent to practical and social realities. He was not someone who said that you should simply accept all forms of suffering with calm resignation. He was, in fact, an ardent and committed social reformer who clearly understood that there was a genuine moral responsibility to minimize suffering that was unnecessary, that had no educational purpose, that was the result only of neglect or injustice. He developed a specific economic vision and program of social reform precisely because he believed that certain forms of suffering should be eliminated. But there was still a third type of suffering that was fundamentally different from these two. There was the suffering that emerges when you finally, genuinely, and deeply confront the reality of who you really are, when your carefully maintained illusions about yourself begin to crumble under the weight of reality, when you are finally forced to drop your psychological defenses and face aspects of yourself that you had been consciously avoiding for years or even decades. This is necessary suffering, educational suffering, suffering that Steiner insisted was absolutely crucial to any genuine spiritual growth. Steiner often described this third type of suffering as being incited and orchestrated by the forces of fate. He used the word destiny not in a fatalistic or deterministic way, not in the sense that everything is rigidly predetermined and you have no genuine free will. It meant something much deeper and much more paradoxical. It meant that there is a loving intelligence that works continually through the specific circumstances of your life, that precisely and carefully orchestrates the particular challenges you need to encounter for your continued development and for your future spiritual evolution. This intelligence is not something external to you. It is not something that is outside and separate from you, operating like an arbitrary God that manipulates your life from the outside. It is actually your own soul at its deepest levels. It is your higher self. It is that part of you that exists in higher dimensions of reality and that has a much broader and much wiser perspective than your ordinary consciousness can access or understand. Your deepest soul, your true soul that exists in higher spiritual realities, knows exactly what kind of experiences you need to have for your continued development. Know what capabilities you need to develop to evolve, what values you need to genuinely learn through lived experience, what persistent illusions you need to abandon to gain true wisdom. And there is strong evidence that this soul continually works to orchestrate the circumstances of its life to present these developmental opportunities precisely. This does not mean that you consciously chose your future sufferings. It means something much more subtle. It means that on a very deep level, in a pre-incarnation meeting where your soul was preparing to enter this life consciously, you worked collaboratively with your spiritual guides to design the general circumstances and major themes that would allow for your most effective development and that would create the most productive opportunities for your continued spiritual evolution. This view offers a completely different and revolutionary perspective on traumatic or painful events that occur in your life. According to conventional scientific materialism, a car accident that kills someone you love is simply a completely random tragedy, an event with no underlying meaning caused by purely blind physical mechanism with no purpose or intention. According to many forms of traditional religion, it is a punishment for sin or a test of faith, or in some other way, an indication of divine displeasure with the individual who suffers. But according to Steiner's view, even such a traumatic and seemingly unjust event can be understood on a much deeper level as an opportunity orchestrated by fate. This does not in any way mean that the event was consciously desired or consciously planned by you in a superficial way. But it does mean that at a very deep level of their existence, the souls involved recognize this experience as an extraordinary opportunity for profound development and significant transformation. Perhaps death was necessary as a crucial step into the next phase of development for that departed soul, a phase that could not be achieved. Begin without the completion of a life. Perhaps those left behind genuinely needed the devastating experience of loss and grief to develop a genuine compassion that could not be developed in any other way. Perhaps the driver who caused the accident needed this horrific and disturbing experience to awaken from a dangerous spiritual complacency that was hindering his development. This does not make the death any less tragic on an ordinary human level. It does not minimize the deep suffering of those who mourn, who face radically altered lives, who carry grief that may never completely disappear. But it offers a profoundly different way of integrating the event into a larger sense of cosmic meaning. Offers a way of finding purpose, not in spite of suffering, but through it and within it. It is this recontextualization of suffering into a greater meaning that is the key to genuine transformation. Steiner was extraordinarily specific and detailed about how you actually access this deeper understanding of the meaning of suffering. He emphasized that it was not enough, according to him, just to know intellectually, just to mentally believe that suffering has a greater cosmic purpose. That would be just replacing one illusion with another illusion, simply exchanging skepticism for blind faith. You should develop the real capacity to see this purpose in action, the capacity to genuinely feel the loving intelligence working through your life circumstances. This requires the development of spiritual faculties that most people ordinarily never exercise during their lives, faculties that remain dormant and inactive. He described these faculties as being analogous to the physical senses, except that instead of perceiving the material, physical world, they perceive spiritual realities, dimensions of existence that completely transcend physical matter. Just as you developed your physical vision throughout your childhood by gradually learning to focus your eyes and correctly interpret the visual signals you receive, you must develop your spiritual vision through systematic and dedicated practice. This involved what Steiner called meditation and active contemplation, not the kind of vague practice that some people mistakenly confuse with genuine meditation, where you just sit and try to mechanically empty your mind of all thought. It was the very active and focused practice of directing your consciousness completely toward a specific object, or truth, and allowing it to reveal itself to you in its living, dynamic entirety. Through this repeated practice, your consciousness gradually changes and expands. You begin to develop new organs of perception. You begin to be able to perceive aspects of reality that were previously completely invisible to you. One specific exercise that Steiner recommended for developing genuine understanding about suffering and its cosmic meaning was what he called meditative imagination about death and the transitions between lives. You don't just think about death in an abstract, detached way. You create a living, lived image of her in your mind. You imagine in vivid detail what happens when you die, how your consciousness separates from your physical body, how you systematically review your newly completed life, how you eventually come to rest in higher spiritual realities. You do this exercise repeatedly, progressively, refining the image, allowing it to become more and more vivid and real in your consciousness. The purpose of this is not to get you to believe a specific story about death and resurrection based on imagination alone. It's just that through repeatedly and seriously contemplating death, you begin to develop a completely transformed relationship with it. It starts to feel less like absolute annihilation and more like natural transition. I mean, when death begins to feel like a natural transition, your relationship to all of life fundamentally changes. Because if death is not the end, if it is simply a transition to other forms of existence and consciousness, then every moment of this current life has meaning in a much larger context. Each experience contributes to something that continues beyond that. And this especially includes experiences of suffering. Steiner also emphasized with great insistence that different forms of suffering have very different qualities and produce distinct and particular effects on the soul. Physical suffering, for example, produces certain very specific effects. It forces you to become heightened aware of your physical body, something that many spiritual people tend to completely neglect or disdain. It forces you to understand that you're not simply a being of pure consciousness, unfortunately imprisoned in a body of meat. You are fully and genuinely incarnated. Your body is not a cosmic mistake or a punishment that you should be ashamed of. It is an extraordinarily precise and complex instrument through which your soul expresses itself and exists in this material world. Physical suffering also often reveals the profound limitations of merely rational and intellectual understanding. When you are in severe, persistent pain, you can't just think rationally away from it. You can't logically argue it away. You're forced to find completely different resources within yourself. You are forced to develop genuine patience, to develop real acceptance, to develop a kind of embodied wisdom that doesn't just come from abstract thought, but that emerges from direct confrontation with bodily reality. Emotional suffering, particularly that which comes from separation, rejection, and profound loss, has completely different qualities and effects than physical suffering. When you lose someone you love deeply, you experience a real and genuine death of a significant part of your life. You had learned to depend on that person in a fundamental way. You have structured significant aspect of your personal identity around them, based your sense of self partially on your relationship with them. His daily routine was closely intertwined with theirs. His sense of meaning was partially anchored in his relationship with them, and suddenly, all of that disappears. There's an abysmal void where there was a familiar presence. It is a suffering that affects not only your rational thoughts, but your entire soul, your fundamental emotional structure. And it is precisely this kind of deep suffering that develops genuine compassion that transcends intellectual sympathy. A person who has never lost someone they deeply loved cannot truly understand the true suffering of another, but someone who has gone through that particular death can. You can be present with someone who is grieving loss in a way that is not merely intellectual or performative. It is genuine presence that comes from lived knowledge. There is also a third type of suffering that Steiner considered perhaps the most important for genuine spiritual development. It was what he called existential suffering, the deep suffering that comes from seriously confronting the fundamental questions of existence. Who am I really? What is truly real? How should I live my life? What does it mean to say that life has meaning? These questions, when taken seriously, when you can no longer avoid or deny them, can produce extraordinary suffering because they can completely dismantle the structures of meaning, and meaning that you have carefully constructed your entire life. If you discover that much of what you believed was illusion, if you discover that many of your life choices were based on assumptions about reality that now seem completely false, there is genuine agony in that. There is the deep feeling that you have lost your own life, that you have wasted years following paths that had no true meaning. But it is precisely this kind of existential suffering that opens the door to genuine radical transformation. Because only when you can endure the complete dismantling of your old structures of meaning, only when you can tolerate the abyss of no longer knowing who you are or what to believe, will you be able to build new structures based on genuine truth rather than inherited illusion or cultural conditioning. Pain is the master that the soul resists the most and needs most. This phrase summarizes a profound truth that every human being eventually learns, although often in a very painful way. Suffering works as an educator because it forces you to change in fundamental ways. It forces you to question your most basic assumptions. It forces you to develop capabilities that you would never have developed in the absence of extreme challenge. Steiner often described this process through the metaphor of death and rebirth. You must die to your previous understanding of reality. It must die to its ancient psychological defenses. It must die to that identity that you have built for years and in which you have invested enormous psychological energy. You must leave everything behind and descend into an abyss where you don't know who you are or what to believe in anymore. It is a genuine death, not a symbolic or merely metaphorical death. You really feel like you are dying. There is real psychological agony. There is real existential fear. There is real despair that threatens your sanity. But it is in this death that genuine rebirth becomes possible. It is in this abyss where you are finally able to let go of all your old certainties and fantasies about yourself and see you can begin to build an understanding of yourself that is based on lived truth rather than imaginary conditioning or desire. A crucial aspect of Steiner's teaching that many people mistakenly leave out is that this suffering is not ultimately sent as punishment or as a sign of rejection. It is not a sign that you have done something fundamentally wrong, that you are unworthy of happiness, that the universe is angry with you like some problem child. It is rather the profound opposite. It is a sign of genuine love and cosmic care. It is the intelligent universe, through the continuous action of your own superior soul, offering you exactly what you need to grow and evolve. A father who genuinely loves his child does not give him everything the child wants at the moment. Sometimes the father has to deny his immediate desires. Sometimes a parent has to allow their child to face unpleasant consequences of their own reckless choices. Sometimes a parent has to allow their child to suffer frustration and even pain, not because his father sadistically wants to see him suffer, but because the father knows deeply that true growth requires necessary discomfort. And a genuinely loving parent will consistently choose their child's true growth over time, even if it is more comfortable in the short term. The same thing is true of the relationship between you and your higher self, between you and those cosmic forces that guide your development as a soul. Your destiny, your challenges, your sufferings are not random accidents governed by luck or chance. They are carefully orchestrated gifts of who you truly are in higher dimensions of consciousness and existence. This does not mean, and Steiner was absolutely clear on this point, that you should passively tolerate every form of pain and suffering you face. If you can alleviate unnecessary suffering, you have a moral obligation to do so. If someone is suffering from genuine hunger, you should feed them, not just tell them that their suffering has a greater cosmic purpose. If someone is being oppressed or abused, you should work to free them, not simply say that their suffering is an opportunity for spiritual learning. Active compassion and genuine social change are legitimate moral responsibilities we all share. But there is also a type of suffering that you cannot alleviate through material action or through practical repair. It is the kind of suffering that emerges from the very fundamental structure of human existence. It is the type of suffering that is inherent to the very process of human development and consciousness. And for this inevitable kind of suffering, the appropriate attitude is not furious, blind resistance, but calm, mindful acceptance, combined with deep trust that there is genuine meaning and loving purpose in it.